In November 1941, a young lieutenant named David Sterling walked into a military detention cell in Cairo. The man inside was 6'2", over 16 stone, and had been locked up for punching an officer. Sterling sat down and said 5 words: "I need men who destroy things." The man on the cot looked at him for a moment, the way a person looks at someone who has just said something either brilliant or completely insane. "What kind of things?" he asked. "Aeroplanes," Sterling said. "On the ground. Behind enemy lines. Small teams, no backup, and no second chances. The generals think it is suicide. I need someone who does not care what the generals think." The man's name was Robert Blair Mayne, former second row for Ireland and the British and Irish Lions, Irish University's heavyweight boxing champion, and a qualified solicitor who at the time was facing a court-martial that would have ended his military career before it started. He had nothing to lose and a particular talent for violence that peacetime had never quite known what to do with. "When do we leave?" Mayne said. The Special Air Service had its first volunteer. 3 weeks earlier, Sterling's idea had nearly killed itself. 62 men parachuted into the Libyan desert to hit Axis airfields, and high winds scattered them across the sand before they reached a single target. Equipment was lost, men died on landing, and by the time the survivors staggered back to friendly lines, only 22 were left. The generals who had warned Sterling told him the unit was finished. The paperwork to disband the SAS was already being drafted. Everything depended on the next operation, and if it failed, the Special Air Service would cease to exist before most people had ever heard of it. Sterling gave the next raid to Mayne. Corporal Johnny Cooper was one of the 5 men assigned to go with him. Cooper had survived the parachute disaster 3 weeks earlier and was under no illusions about what they were walking into. Years later, in interviews he gave before his death in 2002, Cooper described the briefing Mayne gave them before the Tamet raid. "It was the shortest briefing I ever attended," Cooper said. "Mayne pointed at a map and said, 'We are going here, we are blowing up their aircraft, and we are walking home.' Someone asked what happens if it goes wrong. Mayne looked at him and said it will not go wrong." That was the briefing. The 14th of December, 1941. The long-range desert group drove them across hundreds of miles of open sand in Chevrolet trucks, navigating by sun compass and dead reckoning, and dropped them within marching distance of Tamet airfield in Libya. 6 men walked the final stretch on foot in the dark. Cooper described what happened when they reached the perimeter. The airfield had a cluster of low buildings at its edge, and one of them had light coming through the shutters. Mayne held up a hand, the patrol stopped, and for a moment they just stood there listening. "There are men inside," Mayne said quietly. "How many do you think?" Cooper guessed 20, maybe more. Mayne nodded. "Stay behind me," he said, and then he walked to the door. Cooper expected him to signal a plan, a flanking position, some kind of coordinated approach. Mayne kicked the door off its hinges, stepped inside with a Thompson submachine gun at his hip, and emptied 50 rounds into a room full of 30 German and Italian pilots. When the magazine was empty, Mayne stepped back out. His face had not changed expression. Cooper was still standing where Mayne had left him. "Right," Mayne said. "Now the aircraft." They moved to the flight line. Each man carried Lewis bombs, 1-pound charges of plastic explosive mixed with thermite that Jock Lewis had designed specifically for the SAS. You pressed one onto the wing of an aircraft, set the time pencil, and walked to the next plane. The thermite burned through the fuel tank and the aircraft became scrap. 14 planes went up in sequence, each detonation lighting the next row of aircraft along the flight line. Cooper described the sound as one long, continuous cracking noise that rolled across the airfield like thunder that would not stop. Then Mayne turned to Cooper and asked a question that Cooper remembered for the rest of his life. "How many bombs do we have left?" Cooper counted. "None," he said. "We have used them all." Mayne looked at the remaining aircraft on the field. There were at least 10 more, sitting untouched at the far end of the flight line. "Then I will do it by hand," Mayne said. Cooper watched him walk to the nearest aircraft, climb onto the wing, pull himself into the cockpit, and begin destroying the instrument panel with his bare hands. He ripped out the flight instruments, tore wiring from behind the dashboard, smashed gauges and pulled the throttle controls out of their mountings. The sounds coming from inside the cockpit were the sounds of metal being forced apart by someone strong enough to do it without tools. He did this to 10 aircraft. One after another, cockpit after cockpit, tearing each one apart until there was nothing left inside that could fly the plane in the morning. Cooper said he stood and watched because there was nothing else to do. He had never seen anything like it and would not see anything like it again. By the time Mayne climbed out of the last cockpit, 24 aircraft had been destroyed, 14 by explosives, 10 by hand. The fuel dumps were burning, the ammunition stores were cooking off, and 6 men walked back into the desert carrying nothing but empty packs and the quiet satisfaction of men who have done something that should not have been possible. The SAS survived. The generals tore up the disbandment paperwork. Sterling had his proof that the idea worked, and the numbers made the case impossible to argue with. 0 casualties. 6 men in, 6 men out, 24 aircraft destroyed, and the cost of achieving the same result by air would have required multiple fighter sorties across several days with expected losses of both pilots and planes. 13 days later, Mayne went back to Tamet. The Germans had repaired the airfield, replaced the aircraft, posted additional guards, and reinforced the perimeter, assuming that nobody would be mad enough to hit the same target twice in 2 weeks. Cooper was on the second raid as well. He described a moment during the approach march when one of the newer men asked Mayne whether the Germans would be expecting them. May thought about it for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "It will save time if they are already awake." He destroyed every replacement aircraft the Germans had flown in, along with the transport vehicles, the fuel stores, and anything else still standing when his team reached the flight line. The intelligence reports that came out of Tamet afterward contained a detail that tells you everything about what the Germans were dealing with. They found the instrument panels ripped out of the cockpits again, the same damage and the same method as before, which meant that whoever had done this had climbed inside the aircraft and torn them apart by hand a second time. The German garrison commander at Tamet requested a transfer. The Germans responded the way any military would, doubling the guards, moving anti-aircraft guns into ground defense positions, placing aircraft in dispersed revetments instead of neat rows, stringing tripwires, and setting up patrols along the approach routes from the desert. None of it worked because the Germans were defending airfields against air attack. They had blast walls, anti-aircraft batteries, and radar. They had nothing designed to stop 6 men walking in from the desert at 2 in the morning. March 1942. Burka Satellite Airfield. Mayne took 3 men with him, Corporals Rose and Bennett and Private Byrne, and the 4 of them walked across open ground toward a defended airfield at night. 4 men against a garrison base with anti-aircraft positions, perimeter guards, and searchlights. They destroyed 15 aircraft. The pattern was establishing itself. At every airfield Mayne visited, he left with fewer bombs than aircraft destroyed, because the difference was made up by a man who climbed into cockpits and tore the instruments out with his bare hands. Other SAS soldiers started carrying pliers to strip wiring from dashboards. Mayne did not carry pliers. Reg Seekings, another early SAS soldier who served alongside Mayne through the desert campaign, described the experience of watching him work on an aircraft cockpit. "It was like watching someone take apart a kitchen," Seekings said. "Except the kitchen was made of metal and the man doing it was using his fingers. You would hear this wrenching sound, then something would come flying out of the cockpit, and then he would move to the next one. Nobody said anything. What do you say to a man who is ripping an aeroplane apart with his hands? You just let him get on with it." The SAS were learning that the limiting factor on every raid was not courage or timing, but the number of Lewis bombs each man could carry across a desert approach march. Most soldiers accepted this as a tactical constraint. Mayne treated it as a problem he could solve personally, and his solution was to climb inside the aircraft and do the work that the missing bombs would have done. By mid-1942, Sterling and Mayne had refined the method further. The early raids were on foot, carried in by the long-range desert group across hundreds of miles of open sand. but the distances were brutal, so the SAS acquired American Willys Jeeps, fitted them with twin Vickers K machine guns front and rear, and turned each one into a mobile weapons platform carrying enough firepower and explosives to destroy a dozen aircraft. This changed everything. The 26th of July, 1942, Sidi Hanish Airfield, Egypt. This was the largest SAS raid of the entire desert campaign, and it looked nothing like what had come before. 18 armed jeeps carrying British and French SAS commandos, with Mayne in the lead vehicle, drove in 2 columns straight onto the airfield at night and opened fire from both sides simultaneously. The twin Vickers guns on each jeep fired 1,200 rounds per minute, and 18 jeeps firing together produced a volume of tracer that turned the airfield into a corridor of light. Cooper, who was driving one of the jeeps, described a moment in the middle of the run when he glanced across at Mayne's vehicle. Mayne was standing up in the jeep, exposed from the waist up, directing the column through the rows of parked aircraft as if he were conducting traffic. Rounds were coming back at them from the perimeter defenses, and Mayne did not sit down once during the entire pass. I shouted at him to get down, Cooper recalled. He either did not hear me or did not care. I'm still not sure which. Up to 40 aircraft were destroyed in a single pass, along with fuel bozers, ammunition stores, and ground vehicles. The SAS lost 2 men killed and 3 jeeps. 18 vehicles drove in, 15 drove out, and behind them Sidi Hanish was burning so fiercely that the glow was visible from 30 miles away. Between December 1941 and the end of the Desert Campaign, the SAS carried out dozens of airfield raids across Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. Sometimes it was Mayne with 5 men on foot, sometimes it was 18 jeeps in formation, and sometimes it was a single vehicle rolling onto an airfield at 2 in the morning with Mayne driving and his gunner on the Vickers. By the time North Africa was over, the SAS under Stirling and Mayne had destroyed more than 400 enemy aircraft on the ground, more than the Royal Air Force had destroyed in the same theatre during the same period. Paddy Mayne personally accounted for more than 130 of those. Most fighter aces in the entire war shot down between 15 and 30 planes in aerial combat, men like Douglas Bader and Johnny Johnson who flew hundreds of sorties in Spitfires to build their tallies. Mayne destroyed more than all of them combined without ever leaving the ground, and he did it with Lewis bombs, Vickers guns, and his hands. Rommel noticed. The Desert Fox, who was losing aircraft faster than Berlin could replace them, reportedly called the SAS the most dangerous men in the British Army, and German High Command eventually issued specific orders under Hitler's commando order that captured SAS soldiers were to be shot on sight. When the enemy changes its rules of war specifically because of you, you have their attention. David Stirling was captured by the Germans in January 1943, and command of the regiment passed to Paddy Mayne, who held it for the rest of the war. He led the SAS through Sicily, Italy, and France, earning a 2nd DSO, then a 3rd. In April 1945, he drove a jeep into a German ambush near Oldenburg, fired a Bren gun from the shoulder while standing in the open, cleared 2 buildings by himself, and then drove back and forth under fire to pull his wounded men out of a ditch one at a time. For that action, he was recommended for the Victoria Cross by Field Marshal Montgomery himself. Someone, somewhere, crossed out the Victoria Cross and wrote a 4th DSO instead. No one has ever explained why. 4 distinguished service orders, more than 130 aircraft, the command of the most famous Special Forces unit ever created, and a man who, when the explosives ran out, climbed into enemy cockpits and tore them apart with his bare hands because he refused to leave a single aircraft standing. The SAS was disbanded in October 1945, and Mayne went home to Northern Ireland, back to the law, back to the quiet life of a solicitor in Newtown Ards. On the 14th of December 1955, exactly 14 years to the day after the first Tamet raid, he was found dead in his car near his home. He was 40 years old. Cooper attended the funeral. Years later, when someone asked him what he remembered most about serving with Paddy Mayne, Cooper thought about it for a while. The thing people always ask about is the violence, Cooper said. The door, the Thompson, the cockpits, and that was real. I saw all of it. But what I remember most is the quiet. Between the raids, between the missions, he was the quietest man in the unit. He would sit for hours reading poetry and writing letters home, and you would never guess what he was capable of until you saw it happen. And then you never forgot. The regiment was reformed in 1947, and it still exists. The men who serve in it know the name Paddy Mayne the way most soldiers know the names of saints, and if you walk into the SAS Regimental Museum at Hereford and look at the record of aircraft destroyed during the Second World War, the number beside his name is still the highest on the list, higher than any pilot, higher than any squadron commander, higher than anyone who ever sat in a cockpit and pulled a trigger. He did it on the ground. He did it with his hands. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Warfare Unspoken. These are the stories that never get told until someone decides to tell them.